My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Bill Mackie. It's March 27th, 2024. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. And Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure.
And go ahead and start telling your story.
So as it relates to LRI and Linfield College, Linfield University now, but so I grew up, well, first in Mill City and then at Bonneville. My dad was a electrical engineer. He was actually ended up in charge of Bonneville Dam. I was getting ready to look at schools, colleges. I was in Stevenson High School, which is in Washington, even though I lived in Oregon. And I was looking at, Oregon State University and some other places and Reed and my dad was a member of IEEE, or actually it was AIEE at that time. And they had programs often.
And that's an engineering program?
Yeah, IEEE is Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. He was an electrical engineer. And they had programs, and one program was in McMinnville at Field Emission Corporation, I think. And so I was probably a junior looking at colleges, and he said, well, let's go to McMinnville. We'll go to that. You interested in that? I said, sure. Sounds good to me. So we went there. That's my first time in McMinnville, and we looked around the college and had dinner somewhere, and then went to this talk. And I really can't quite remember who talked. It probably was Lynn. But I was interested in physics at that time, so that I was all eyes and ears. It was fun. But that turned me on to Linfield and Linfield Research Institute, because that was explained what that was and whatnot. And so I applied and got accepted and came here in '67, the fall of '67. And I got a stipend from LRI. Well, it was like $100 or something. But what was it for? Well, it was for, you got this to encourage you to go to the science symposiums, or whatever they were called, physics talks, basically, they had. Which was fine, I probably would have gone to them anyway, but $100 that's all right. And I met Dran Hamby. He was the director of LRI, and Mary Lou Schroeder was the business manager. Of course, she just passed away here recently. Spent many hours in Mary Lou's office just talking, because I think she was the surrogate mom for everybody in the sciences, I think. Anyway, I was encouraged to talk to other students that were doing stuff, and so I quickly, found I think one of my first was Jim Dunphy. He was working on a nephelometer. He was working under John Day, doing particle detection in air. And it was this technical thing he was working on. Also met Bill Thomason. There were a couple of seniors that I hung out with. And John Leese. John Leese is back in town. He was working, he was doing, I can't remember what he was doing, some meteorology thing. He ended up getting a PhD in meteorology in the Air Force. And Thomason was working on some electron emission project, and that's kind of where I ended up working on that at the time. Anyway, probably in about so I spent my undergraduate years, once I got to Linfield, I didn't leave, not even in the summers, because I started doing research with folks and worked on electron emission and from materials. And the summers were fun because we would do other things. I remember one time we went, there was another alum, I can't recall his name at the moment, but he came back to do some summer stuff. And Dran Hamby was there, and we all hiked up Mount Hood. That was kind of fun. So I spent all summers there, and in So I was familiar with Field Emission Corporation, which was known locally as FEMCOR. They had the research was the old LRI building, which is the art building, the old part of the art building. And they also had where Gallery Players was. They had most of that block where they had production. FEMCOR made X-ray tubes, flash X-ray tubes. They were not just your standard dental X-ray machines. They were quite sophisticated. Some were very high power, very high power. It had a 2 million keV, a 2 million EV source. They had some flash X-ray tubes that would stop action, the fastest things you could do at the time. I remember, I think I even have some pictures of that. They took X-rays of like bullets going through a cup. It's just something to demonstrate that they could freeze the action, and the bullet would look like the cup is kind of plastic. It just kind of starts to explode. Anyway, they did a lot of, they sold that to researchers and all sorts of other things. In any event, I used to take the LRI pickup and go down to on Ford Street there, where they had the production, and pick up some liquid nitrogen for the systems in the basement of Graph. Anyway, and so I also spent a little time at FEMCOR, the research R&D place out here, since that was near, and I got to know the glass blower because he taught glass blowing, and I took that class as a freshman, and I took a second class, probably as a sophomore, and they did help me on some technical stuff, mechanical stuff. Probably in about 70, I can't remember when, I think I have that in my notes, when Hewlett-Packard bought out FEMCOR, but it was probably in 71 or 74, somewhere in there. Anyway, in 70, they for some reason, they were folding up the R&D part. And so most everybody came to LRI at that time. I was probably a junior and working, and so all of a sudden we had all kinds of people there. The machinist came, Dick Strayer, Lynn Swanson, Tony Bell, and a few others came, and that was all in the basement of Graph at that time. Oh, Noel Martin, he was the technical. He could do anything technical. So they set that up, and I quickly got on with them and did work under Lynn, again with electron emission properties and whatnot, and work function of materials. So that carried on 71, and about 71, Noel Martin mentioned that they were starting a company. And I know he said this, I think Lynn would deny it, but he said they're going to start Field Electron and Ion Associates, FEI Associates. That's the name Noel told me at the time. I remember that clearly. I'm not sure Lynn, anyway, he always just called it FEI, and that's stuck, and that's what it's always been. So that was in the basement of Graph Hall, and Noel was working on his own refiner for tungsten wire, because that was the first thing they made. Lynn was also doing research, and I think it was Gary Cabe was a student on that, on what's called a Schottky source, the Schottky emitter. That turned out to be one of FEI's largest and biggest product. In any event, I graduated in 71. I was set to go to graduate school somewhere. Lynn wanted me to go to like Chicago or where there's field of mission people. And I applied to various places, and I can't remember if I got accepted, but for some reason I didn't go. I decided to do other things. So I ended up doing various things. This is kind of an aside, it doesn't fit with LRI, but my background, I was a builder, a beekeeper, and a bureaucrat. Not in that order. I started off as a bureaucrat. I worked for the Oregon Department of Energy. Actually, to start with, I started the energy office at the county through the planning department. That was probably in the early 70s. And from there, I got a job at Oregon Department of Energy, working on conservation projects. And during that time, I was working on passive solar and construction techniques to conserve energy, insulation, and little subtle building changes and passive solar. But that was a bureaucratic job, and it got kind of tiring. So I ended up working for a guy doing some building, and then was able to get my contractor's license. So I designed and built solar houses around here, passive solar and conservation. Well, through when I was my time at the Oregon Department of Energy, I did talks to local builders and to everybody on conservation projects. So I had a lot of information. So I parlayed that into actually working in the area and doing some solar remodels and some new spec houses and whatnot. But then that was like in the late 70s, and the economy was going and interest rates were going up and various things. So at the same time, I was working with a builder that he was also a beekeeper. And he was a semi-commercial beekeeper, and so I got interested in that. So I kept bees, and with another person, Jerry Smith, we had each about 200 hives at one point. So we ran bees from California all the way through Oregon. And then probably in the early 80s, or maybe I could look that up, but anyway, I got a call. I had a part I needed to machine for my bee truck. I put together a hive lifter, because they're heavy. And I knew the tool I needed was at the shop at LRI. And so I went over there, talked to Dran, and he says, well, you got to talk to the shop guy, because he's a curmudgeon, and he won't let, you got to ask him. So I asked him, and he let me use the shaper. So I used that. Well, that was sort of random that I went over there to do that, because I hadn't had contact with anybody over there for a long time. Well, it turned out, unfortunately, the old guy that was running the shop passed away in the middle of the semester, as I recall. And Drannon immediately called me and says, hey, can you come over and help out? And I says, well, sure. I was kind of winding down on beekeeping in a way. So I said, yeah, that'd be good. So I finished, I think, that semester, the shop class, and he says, we'll put you on, almost full time, but not really. So I taught shop, glass blowing, and some really basic math courses, which they don't even offer anymore, so they're so basic. And then I taught algebra and algebra trig. So I was working here. At that time, I thought, maybe I should go back to graduate school like I started. And in fact, the dean, I had to have regular meetings with the dean, and he told me, you're not going to get anywhere without a degree. So I said, okay, fine. So I knew Lynn was at Oregon Graduate Center at that time. It turned into Oregon Graduate Institute, which now is nothing. It sort of merged with OHSU. It used to be OHSU, and when it merged, they put an "and" in there. OH, and SU. And the physics program has had applied PhD and master's and PhD in applied physics. That program is no more, but I still think they have some other parts of it, but I haven't kept track. Anyway, Lynn was up there, so I went up and started immediately working on some research at LRI, because so I got on, Drannon was kind enough to put me on to teach some other minor things that didn't require an advanced degree. And, but Clancy Heinrichs was there, and he wanted to do some research, and he got a little money to do it and put me on doing some research. He was research on zirconium carbide. Started doing research, it was elementary research on the properties of zirconium carbide. I also simultaneously went up to OGI, and I didn't actually enroll for a PhD program. I said, I'd like to take up classes. They said, sure. So I took, I think, a couple classes for the first year, and then they says, you're on if you're in the program if you want. I don't have to do any tests or anything. So I said, sure. So but I was doing research, and that research was led to my thesis topic, dissertation topic. And so I started that, basically at the same time as I started taking the classes. So basically 3 years later, I had all my coursework, did my most of my dissertation work, and so I was pretty quick on getting my PhD. Did my defense and whatnot. That was so. At that time, then Bob Jones was retiring, and so there was an opening, and I thought, well, that's just kind of what I want now. I don't have my dissertation quite, but I was doing my defense like in June, and they were going to hire that summer. And so I applied and got my defense done, and I ended up getting the position. There was another person that that everybody liked also, but she ended up in George Fox. So I think everything worked out. So I was doing research. So my first contract, I think it was the first year or so, I was working about full-time, because I had got release time to do research because I was doing, and so I worked all summer. I was a 12-month person here at Linfield. And then over subsequent years, as more money came in, I ended up buying myself out of my teaching. Not completely, but maybe a third or so. So I was working, 2/3 at teaching, and 2/3 actually, again, because I was working the summer also, doing research. So, and LRI grew then again at that time. So I have some slides I can show you on that. It's gone, the start of LRI was in like 59, 58 or 59. I have that on my slide, when Walt Dyke founded it. He was physics professor doing research on electron emission. And so there was a big growth there. They had over 50 employees. I have a picture of them. And they put up this, the art building was the LRI, and then it was Field Emission Corporation. So after Field Emission Corporation spun off, Linfield had a slight decline then, because most everybody went to FEMCOR. Then when I was a student, it was small but still functioning, but then there was another resurgence when everybody from FEMCOR, the R&D ended up at Linfield again, Lynn and whatnot, and that was the time of the second spinoff, FEI. And then when he left and the people most of everybody went up to OGI. Tony Bell was teaching up there. Lynn, Noel Martin came with Lynn. So it was Lynn, Noel Martin, and Lloyd Swenson started. And Swenson was a business professor, as I remember. So, then it was probably a little lag. There was some work being done, but that was my time when I was doing other things, so I don't recall what exactly was happening then. But then I came back, and Clance and I were doing research, and then I started to get grants, and I had students, and I got some slides of that. But LRI was pretty good size. We had millions of dollars a year of research. And then I spun off applied physics. And how that happened was I was doing work on the carbides, zirconium carbide, hafnium carbide, and a variety of related research topics surrounding that. And I had lots of students. At times I had over 20 students working for me, which was fun. I enjoyed that. I think they did too. Let's see. What was I going to get into? Oh, I know how Aptech started. So I designed and built some zone refiners. So when Clancy got this money to do this work on looking at electron emission properties of zirconium carbide, there was no source of single crystal zirconium carbide. So the first year or two I had and went into a lot of my dissertation was how to produce the crystals to start with, before we even started working on what properties they had. So that took a bit of effort. And when that finally we could then zone refine a lot of materials that were similar to that. They were very high temperature melting materials. Hafnium carbide is like the highest melting point binary compound there is. It melts at like almost 4,000 degrees centigrade, which is insanely hot. So I had this system to do that, and I would give research talks, and people would say, "Gee, I'd like some of that," or "I'd like to try. How can you do this?" And so we started to get requests, and with payments to do work, and that didn't seem like the thing to do through LRI. So I decided, actually Gary Cabe was working. He worked for FEI since just about after he graduated. And so Gary and I got Gary down to work at LRI with me. He was a technician, very good. He had a master's in physics, so he was well qualified. But he could do electronics and fix things and vacuum systems. So I hired him, and then at that time we were thinking about how do we fulfill these orders through LRI, and we decided, let's just start a company. So we did, and I had a place on Booth Bend Road out here, and I had built up a big shop and warehouse and a honey room. Well, the honey room wasn't getting used so much anymore, so that was where Aptech started, in the honey room. We built a zone refiner in there, and turned out we had a decent sized decent for us, $20,000. That was a lot of money for us when we were just getting going, to make some crystals for Bettis Labs. They were doing some work for the government. And so we did that. We were trying to grow it. We ended up moving to the whites, yes.
The greens.
The greens, yeah. So that was, Linfield had it, but they had just acquired it, I think. And so they leased out space in there. So that's where that was Aptech. We leased out a couple of spots, and there were some other people leasing out things. I can't remember what else was in there at the time. So we built that, and concurrently I was doing research and whatnot, and I had a lot of students, and a few students would go to go to FEI for summer work. I encouraged that because that was just something different. And I had one student that was up there, and I was trying to put together another zone refiner for tungsten, because I had been to conferences and people says, well, we'd also like that too. A little clarification here. The zone refiner for the carbides and the borides is different from the one for tungsten. And we only had the one for carbides and borides, the high temperature stuff. Of course, tungsten's high temperature too, but these are done in not a vacuum, they're done in inert gas. And the reason is because in a vacuum at melting point, these materials would sublimate, they just evaporate. So they had to be done at atmospheric pressure in argon, something inert that wouldn't oxidize it. And so that system was different than the one for tungsten. Tungsten does not sublimate at melting point, and it needs to be very clean, so that's done in a vacuum. So there's two different systems. So I was working on the second system to do tungsten. And my student was up there, and he happened to mention to somebody, they were talking about they were having trouble getting their tungsten zone refined, and he says, well, why don't you ask Mackie, because he's putting together a system. They go, what? So they came to me and said, well, you are, huh? Let's buy a couple. So I sold them a few, and they said, oh, here, I'll tell you, we'll work out a deal. You don't sell it to anybody else, but you make it all for us. And so at that point, that was in like January of 2000. And by the middle of the year, they wanted us to really expand. Well, there were two things that led to this expansion. One, we had a research contract at LRI for Hewlett-Packard to work on this memory storage device, this using field emitters. Really interesting, high capacity memory storage device. And they wanted to up our contract with the research, because they wanted to put together a great big system and do it, and they wanted, they were scared of anybody getting the information out. They wanted secrecy. And they knew we had applied physics, and they says, you know, I think we're going to do it through your applied physics, because you know, students have to get thesis and it has to be published, and they didn't want any of that. They didn't even want anybody to know what they were doing, how they were doing it. So we said, fine. So in May of 2000, we rented space out where we currently are, or AppTech currently is, or out on off of Riverside. And it was a 10,000 square foot building. We rented just a little over half of it, I think. And the other half was another company. And what was in that building when we moved in there, it was some kind of a big machine shop. It was just big empty space with some office. We had this big space and kind of rattling around. We put together all our systems in there and worked for Hewlett-Packard on this project ended up working for them for 2 or 3 years. As an aside, where that project went, we almost had it working, everything working in this memory storage, but they said they lost their business slot in the market, and they were going to go a different direction. So, but meanwhile, FEI, they wanted us to do their tungsten, and so we put together systems and hired people, and the first person I hired was at the green buildings. But they went out here and then I quickly hired more people, and so that was kind of the start of applied physics. We had a lot of work for FEI, but then we started getting work for other people. They had a product line of the boride cathodes, and lanthanum hexaboride and cerium hexaboride. So we ended up making that material too, and then we ended up making the crystals for them. And then they says, we don't want this product line anymore. It's going downhill. It's not going to amount to anything. You guys want it? And they said, sure, we'll buy it. So we bought it. We had to pay for them. So we bought it, and actually that was fortuitous because it went the other way for us. There were more uses of that stuff so that helped applied physics expand. For example, at that time, they were being used, those cathodes were being used in electron microscopes primarily, and the Schottky emitters were replacing them. So they figured that was going to go downhill. They weren't going to use that anymore, and there weren't much any uses. Because FEI was really into their Schottky source. They had done lots and lots of research on that, really expanding it, and they needed the tungsten wire, which we were supplying. So they did away with the borides, but as it turned out, the borides had uses that Schottky couldn't hit because they needed, Schottky was a nice microscopic source, high current, but very small, which you need for imaging something very small. But for something where you needed to, pump lots of current into it, it wouldn't work. It was not suitable. And when you needed a big, for instance, 3D printing. At that time, there was an outfit, Arcam in Sweden, that was making 3D printers, not for plastics or anything, but for metals, for high temperature metals and sophisticated metal like titanium and titanium alloys. And they could make engine blocks for Italian race cars, and they did, and they were started to make turbine blades. Arcam got bought out by General Electric, which makes jet engines. And so that market went ballistic, and we sold thousands of cathodes to them, and they just keep expanding. So the borides turned out to be a good deal for us. We were still working with carbides and still selling them, but anyway, AppStec started to expand, and I was still teaching. I was still teaching 2/3 time until I retired in 2018, 19. AppTec grew. I was starting to wish I was getting retired. Needless to say, I didn't have enough retirement savings because most savings went into AppTec over the years. So I knew I had to get it out of AppTec. That's the only way I had to do it. So I ended up selling AppTec. And I guess I won't go into quite some of this detail, but a foreign company wanted it, and they wanted to keep it where it is. There were some other companies that wanted it, but they wanted to move it offshore. And I thought, well, that's kind of backwards. When a U.S. company wanted to move it to Europe, and a Japanese company wanted to keep it right here and keep the same name and allow me to hire my successor. They did not want to put in anyway, so Hitachi bought it. When I sold, we had 25 employees. I just checked with them. I go out there every once in a while to answer some questions. I think they're up to 40 now. And they moved R&D up to Hillsboro, so they now have a new place up in Hillsboro. Production is going to remain here because they just spent over $1 million to remodel. And so they put in a huge clean room. So that's sort of it on a first cut. So
that's a lot. I'm gonna go back and fill in some questions here. So let's go back to student days for you here. I'm curious, outside of LRI and the work there, which I have some more questions about too, but other interests, other courses of interest or activities you were doing outside of the science-based?
At Linfield?
Yeah.
Well, I taught. One of my favorite classes was modern physics. And the other class I liked was the general physics class because I was interested in doing demonstrations. I always thought students learned a little bit faster if they could see something. And so I like that. I remember once I was at a conference in Boston, and I ended up at afternoon off. I went up to MIT and found some professor underling that was teaching some labs, and I got a lot of information from him about how to do things. That was fun. So doing demonstrations, and so all the years at Linfield, I worked for 34 years, I think, teaching, and I never took a sabbatical. And they says, at one point, they said, you got to take a sabbatical. I said, well, I mean, I'm doing research. I don't want to give that up. And so, yeah, you got to take, okay, fine, I'll take a sabbatical. I want to do physics theater. And so I had a bunch of students over a summer, and I put together a little kind of a seminar on physics theater. And so I always remember I had, you know, when you're coming back after sabbatical, you got to give a faculty lecture. So that was fun. We did physics theater for faculty lecture, and all the students helped me, and I thought it went over really well. Anyway, I've continued to do that to this day. I just did Science Fest out at Evergreen for Carleton Observatory. I got involved with the Carleton Observatory because, oh yeah, they got a hold of me when I was still at Linfield, because they knew Linfield had a bunch of old telescopes. I had used that old Queen's telescope. That Queen's telescope was built in 1889 or 1888. And I had used it. Actually, Wynne Dolan, who was the math professor here, and he did a lot of work with Walt Dyke on the early theories of field emission. Anyway, he showed me how to use that telescope when I was an undergraduate. As it turned out, I was probably the only one that used that dang thing and still remembered it. So anyway, other people ended up donating. I had hired, when at LRI, I had hired Paul Davis, who actually was my dissertation advisor, along with Lynn, to LRI, and then he got on at the college teaching too. But he was interested in astronomy, so he taught the astronomy course. I was always going to teach it, but I never could fit it in. And at the time, people knew he was teaching astronomy, and so the sheriff's office ended up donating a lot of telescopes to Linfield. Well, how'd they get these telescopes? They were nice telescopes. Well, they were from drug busts. So Linfield had a lot of these telescopes, and they weren't used. They were just sitting in the back room. Yeah, I mean, I thought that was sort of interesting. Anyway, they weren't used. The Queen's telescope got replaced with a nice one, and we had students doing research with that telescope. Some worked on some binary stars. They could sense you could tell the rotation because of the intensity of the star would vary. You assume that's when it. Anyway, so other than that nice telescope that had been currently in use until the observatory got turned into a quickie mart, which is another story. All that got donated to Carleton Observatory. And so I got involved with them, especially since that Queen's telescope went out there, and I built a wheel stand for it to move around, and we fixed it up. And so it's currently working more or less, but they have other telescopes that work quite well. In fact, I'm working on a stand for a solar telescope, a really nice solar telescope they have. And so, yeah, back to where I started, demonstrations. I still do that. That was kind of fun. Do other things. I always like to go camping and do that. water skiing when we go camping. So I would take the students every summer, a couple carloads of them on the boat up to Detroit Lake, and we'd go water skiing. That was kind of fun. We did other things. As a student, I've worked with a few high school students. There was one, I can't recall his name right now, but he was quite advanced and he wanted to do a project. And there's very few experimental things you can do that demonstrate quantum mechanical effects. Just by the nature of it, there are not too many things. I mean, field emission is a quantum mechanical effect, but anyway, we devised an experiment and he did it and it worked. And you could see the quantum mechanical effect in the data. So there were other things. When superconductors came out, the Waikubo 123, this yttrium, barium, copper oxide. Well, I got a formula how to make this stuff, so we did. A student and I we made some, and it worked. That was kind of fun. I still use that in demonstrations.
Tell me about the relationship between LRI underneath Linfield. How did it function as a subsidiary of the school?
So it was set up. LRI was set up as a independent but affiliated entity. It was its own nonprofit, but I don't know what they called it. The president was supposed to be on the board, and has been to this date. And I think they were supposed to have one or two of the other board members as on the Linfield board as well. So there was some overlap that way. I can speak best of the time I was dealing with it. Of course, Linfield needing funds all the time, we're trying to figure out who got the overhead. I ended up, buying out my research time, and my employees, the technicians like Gary and a few others, they got their payroll ran through Linfield, but then all the overhead associated with that went to Linfield. So there was some negotiation on how the finances worked between them. I recall we didn't have to pay rent for the space, but then we used students. I mean, the shop was LRI, but the classes were physics in the physics department. A lot of other places used it. We did work for the art department, cutting zinc plates for their, whatever they use them for, etching. So yeah, I would say was beneficial to both entities, and should be. That's the way it should be. There was a benefit in running student payroll through LRI. If, for example, I hired a student and paid him through the college, then the college would know and would subtract that income from their whatever work study, say, or something like that. Well, that didn't benefit the students. So if I did it separately, then it was separate, and they got both. Now, in terms of taxes, and it washed out, because the next year all that back would go. Their income would. So there was nothing shady about it, but for the student, it was a benefit.
As the LRI grew and the various businesses started to kind of take off from it, I'm curious about sort of McMinnville, how it fit in the area, how it fit in the town. What was the kind of what do people think about LRI and how it was involved?
I think that it was a positive thought. I know Femcor, that was a big employer at the time, and so the townspeople and the mayor and whatnot all knew that Femcor, Field Emission Corporation, was kind of fondly called Femcor. I think APTEC, we engaged with the town a lot. We did a lot of donations. We specifically wanted to do that, and we were involved with the mayor's ball and all kinds of things. So I thought that was positive. I was on the Chamber of Commerce committee or something. But FEI, maybe not so much, but basically because they left, they moved up to Hillsborough right away. So I think in general, LRIs, and I've given this talk to a lot of people in town, just to refresh their memory on LRI. Not so much recently, of course. But. So I specifically talked about the spin-offs. I got some old photos in here, and I think I have some of the originals on here. So 55, looks like LRI was established in 55 by Walt Dyke. He was a professor of physics here at the time. And he had done, I think he was at University of Washington and had done some stuff on field emission work. And so he started LRI to do the research. And there were a lot of people here. A lot of professors were involved. And a lot, even the math, like I mentioned, Wynne Dolan, because they were doing the theoretical part of it too, on how does that work. Here's a picture of around 1958 of the LRI staff. Now you can see the Linfield Research Institute. Where was that? Well, I'm not quite sure. I think it was Colonial Hall.
Okay, before they burned it down.
Before they burned it down, I think that's where this was.
Where the observatory used to be, next on the outside of Pio.
You know where the observatory way back went?
Yeah. The original location.
Yes.
Yeah, because Colonial Hall was sort of between the observatory and Pioneer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's where I had thought I'd heard that. So, there were 50-some employees. This is, I can't remember the people, I'd have to look at it again to remember, but this is some vacuum systems, old vacuum systems. This was in the late 50s, early 60s. When I came here in 67, they were still here. So I did a lot of work on those. So established in 55, Walt Dyke. The first company spinoff was Field Emission Corporation in 58. It flourished in 1970. The researchers from FEMCOR came to LRI. The second company spinoff was FEI. That was in 71. And then when I was doing research here, LRI grew again, and the third company spinoff was Applied Physics. Well, this just says some of the research I was doing, what applications they might have. Materials for electron sources, flat panel displays, we were trying to work on that. Sophisticated radar systems, phased arrays, they're called, lithography, and some space propulsion work. This shows some of the income and students we had. This number of students versus the year. So, it peaked about in before Applied Physics spun off. Applied Physics formed in 95. So I was running, well, actually closer to 40 students a year. This is some of them. This is 93, my summer research crew. We'd also go over here, the softball field was close in at that time. We'd play softball every afternoon.
So where is that picture taken?
In the basement of Graph.
That's basement of Graph, okay.
Yeah, this is the vacuum lab, the basement of Graph. I think I have 3 of them here. A lot of these people went on to advanced degrees. This was one in 95, and this is one in 98. I think Clancy's in this. Paul Davis is in this. Gary Cabe is in this. So FEI started then. It was later bought by Hewlett-Packard in 71. They split the company into 2. There was the X-ray tube, and then Hewlett-Packard, when they were here actually they built this building, right? They were doing, they still had the X-ray tube business. And I used to come over here to this building and talk to the technicians to help me do some brazing on some projects I was working on. But they also had the medical division, and they did defibrillators and other electronic parts. Pacemakers and whatnot. So that was sort of two. That business went to the East Coast when Hewlett-Packard left here. And the X-ray, I think, went to California, but I think that's since sold. I think they sold that. Well, FEI company was started in '71. They merged with the division of Philips at one point, and then with Micron, and finally with Thermo Fisher here more recently. So FEI is no more. It's now Thermo Fisher. That was Thermo Fisher Scientific in 2016. Applied Physics started in '95, and it was finally bought by Hitachi High-Tech in 2019. First, right off the bat in January of 2019. This is some miscellaneous stuff from Field Emission Corporation. Well, it says here we still use we use that. LRI had a Faxitron. It was like a small oven kind of a thing. Had a door, but it was, you put the sample in there and turn on the X-ray, and you could X-ray anything you wanted to, basically. I mean, back in the heyday, back in the 50s and early 60s, they were trying X-rays for all kinds of stuff. The biology department was irradiating animals, and I don't know, X-raying them. And, yeah, right. In fact, there was a tube in the basement that I saved. I don't know if it's still, maybe you have.
Maybe.
That John Bowling, he was a professor of biology, used. It had this kind of this funny cavity that for rats to go into. Anyway. But they did all sorts of stuff. We used it for crystallography. We used the X-ray because we needed to have single crystals, and we had to have the orientation of the crystal right. That was our product, because electrons come off of certain crystal directions easier than others. So obviously, if you're making an electron source, you want an easy source of electrons. So you need the proper orientation, and to do that, you use X-rays. X-rays hit it, bounced off, and made this pattern on the screen or film. And so that's what that Faxitron we used for. FEI company got big fast. And Aptec, yeah, we moved in 2000. Well, currently that's 10,500 square. That's the building they're in now, but that's now production, and R&D moved up into an equal-sized building up in Hillsboro.
And that's when you said it was over off Riverside Drive in that area? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On Miller Street, 1600 Miller Street.
You mentioned obviously Hewlett-Packard being here, Hewlett-Packard buying Femcor.
Correct.
What was the relationship like between HP and LRI, and did things change when HP left town?
Well, I think anywhere HP is, the townspeople like that because they have jobs. I mean, they're in Corvallis. There's a big HP outfit in Corvallis. In fact, that's the HP that worked with us, not the leftover was here back in the 2000. Yeah, so let's see. I was just graduating and leaving Linfield when Hewlett-Packard bought out Field Emission Corporation. So I'm not too aware of what exactly, how that was. I mean, in terms of the town, it was a good deal because they built this thing, and so they expanded and hired a lot of people. When they left, I think that was probably a down point. But
so tell me about, from the perspective of LRI specifically, what are the biggest accomplishments to come out of LRI? Yes, aside from the businesses that respond, what did LRI accomplish?
Students. It was Walt Dyke set it up to do research, but it was always a student component was integral to that, to the workings. They did a lot of theoretical, hundreds and hundreds of papers over the years. Of all three ended up spin-offs, but also ancillary papers from lots of different departments. But students were a key throughout the whole thing. Walt Dyke always had a desire to employ students and have them do hands-on research. I'd go to conferences and I'd meet with researchers, and they were always with big universities and big time, had PhD programs and whatnot. And they kept asking me, how can you do it here? And I says, man, it's great. The students do PhD quality research. They may not be quite there to do the theory part, but they can do the hands-on. And I think during my time there and all the other students that worked there, that's what, most of them were experimentalists, not all, but anybody applying to a PhD program, a student, they had legs up on everybody else if they had hands-on experience. So I think was a big takeaway, big positive that LRI was able to provide. Because there are lots of students that went on for advanced degrees. In fact, back when I started, we were, as Linfield always does, they try to get students. I mean, that's a continuing problem, to keep the enrollment up. And we would call, and I remember we would get tear sheets from the registrar's office or admissions, and we'd make calls to all students, and we could tell. And we had statistics back then. I think we were highly ranked in terms of physics programs whose graduates went on to get advanced degrees in Oregon. We were like number 3, or I think the only ones ahead of us were Oregon State and maybe Reed, and then Linfield.
It's impressive.
Yeah. And a lot of that was due to the research opportunities students got through LRI.
So with AppTech then, tell me about, you mentioned a little bit about the growth of it before you sold it. Were there sort of benchmarks for you along the way? Were there memorable accomplishments or memorable achievements along the way?
Well, I suppose, there's always papers you present. That's sort of a benchmark, I guess. I always had students too. I had students every summer, 1 or 2 at AppTech, and during the school year too. They've gone off to do all sorts. I won't mention his name, but there was one student that was more of a theorist rather than a mechanic. So, they start in it the first day or 2 at AppTech. What do you have them do? Is, you can't start right off the bat. So I had him put together this shelf or something. I can't remember. And he says, "Well, I got it done, Bill. Well, I don't think it's quite tight." He says, "Well, I tighten them as tight as I get them." Well, you tighten them the wrong way. Okay. And then I had him drill something, and he had the drill in backwards. He's got a PhD in theoretical physics now and doing well. He ended up doing a great job at AppTech. Once he learned the ropes, I'm not knocking him at all. It was just kind of humorous to me. But he ended up doing PhD quality research and got a paper out of it. We published a paper, and he ended up going to graduate school and getting a PhD himself. Things break with undergraduates. I break stuff. I can't say it. It's just them. Things would break. I said, let's do it again. It's no big deal. Things break. experiment goes bad, yeah, that's the way it goes.
Tell me about the evolution of Linfield, the larger entity of Linfield, from your time as a student. Obviously, you spent a lot of time here. So tell me about the growth and evolution of Linfield, the institution.
Yeah, it's grown a lot. It's changed. I think there's been good things and bad things. Being on a faculty and watching the faculty interact has been sort of interesting. And how they relate to the president's office and the deans and whatnot. So there have been good times and there have been slightly better, worse times in that regard. But Linfield's always, progressed. I think this new era is going to be a good one. So there's been a lot. So the football program, for example, athletics. The football program's been big. I mean, they have how many 60-some years of winning streak?
60-something, yeah.
65? That's pretty amazing. But how does physics fit in with that? Does it fit in with that? Well, surprisingly, it does. There are a lot of recruitment of football players, for example, not saying there aren't other areas, but that want to be engineers or go into science or something. And so that's physics. And so we've recruited a lot over the years, and I've had students working for me who are, good athletes. And so Linfield is good because it's a liberal arts school, and that is a good thing, I think, because it makes one well-rounded in all areas, from Shakespeare to Einstein.
As you look at it, the school today, or even just when you retired from it, what were the notable differences outside of, obviously it had grown in size? What were the notable differences from when you kind of were first familiar with the school?
Well, yeah, the size, definitely. What's the student body now?
1,700.
Yeah, so that's a fairly good growth, but that's not grown over the last few years, though, has it? Because I think it was around 1,700 back in 10 years ago.
The peak was about 2,700. That was in the 90s, I believe, or early 2000s.
So I suppose that and the facilities. I mean, the facilities are nicer.
You had a chance to see the new science building?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's a nice space.
Yes. Knowing the physics department, the physics space in the basement is good, but that doesn't get shown on most tours. For one thing, it's behind closed doors, unfortunately. So, but yeah, it's a good space.
So tell me a little bit about what you're up to now, post Linfield faculty. What's your life like now?
It's good. So I've always worked on stuff, so I like to build stuff, and so I finally came up with a shop that's a good enough shop I like. It's a wood shop, it's a metal shop. I can do all kinds of metal work, and I even have a glass shop. We have a beach house, and I have a glass lathe and a setup out there. So I keep busy. I'd still like to do demonstration stuff, if not for my grandkids around town. I hope to get involved. So the Science Fest was put on by Carleton Observatory, but it's housed at Evergreen. But it was for Carleton Observatory, and hopefully they're trying to do a fundraising to put up a real observatory and planetarium and a little space for demo stuff and talks and whatnot. They need quite a few bucks for that, probably like 12 million or something to really get it going. But I would like to, so this was for mostly kids, and for little kids, they did little like lunar lander things out of paper cups and whatnot. But I did some physics demo stuff, and there was some chemistry demo stuff, and it wasn't bad. There were like three close to 350 kids there. But what interests me is to do this again out at a winery, and they're interested in doing this too for adults. And I think that would be a lot of fun to do physics demo, physics theater for adults, something like that. I mean, there's a lot of gee whiz stuff, but it's all based on physics principles that you'd like to explain as you go. So, yeah, so what am I doing? Traveling, building stuff in the shop, working on a telescope stand so they can move it around.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah, it is. I can't complain.
Well, excellent. It's all the questions that I have for you. Anything we didn't cover that you wanted to cover?
Oh, maybe, but that's probably good enough for now.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your story with us, sharing the history of LRI. It's been super fascinating, and I appreciate that. And we'll let you off the hook.
Okay.
Thank you.